Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Marco Rios had no inkling that the final moments of peace he experienced in Port Charles would soon unravel into a living nightmare. In a calculated but ultimately misguided act of vengeance, Sonny Corinthos, driven not by strategy but by desperation and pain, ordered Jason Morgan to abduct Marco, believing that taking the son of Jen Sidwell hostage would force the elusive enemy to either submit or expose himself. Marco was ambushed and restrained, his hands bound tightly behind his back, and thrown into a dim, windowless room where the only reminders of the outside world were the heavy footsteps of Jason as he entered and exited in chilling silence. The room smelled of damp wood and dust, the air thick with uncertainty and fear. Each hour passed like a lifetime for Marco, whose only crime was bearing the last name Sidwell. What Sonny failed to realize was that this action, fueled by emotional impulsiveness rather than strategic calculation, was a grave misstep. Marco was innocent. He had no part in his father's web of deceit and manipulation. In truth, he had always kept his distance from Jen Sidwell's covert dealings and ruthless ambitions, often questioning the man's morality but powerless to detach himself completely from the expectations that came with his bloodline. Now, Marco was nothing more than collateral damage. An expendable pawn in a war he never chose to be a part of. He tried, repeatedly, to make his case to Jason, pleading through choked whispers and exhausted gasps for a chance to explain. But Jason, ever stoic and disciplined in his loyalty, remained unmoved, at least outwardly. Internally, however, a crack had begun to form. There was something in Marco's eyes, something raw and unguarded, that Jason hadn't expected: truth. It lingered there, trembling, as if challenging the years of programming that told Jason to obey first and question never. Elsewhere, Jen Sidwell, a man who moved through shadows like smoke, continued his masterstroke from behind layers of deception and influence. To the outside world, he appeared caught off guard, even shaken, by the news of Marco's kidnapping. But beneath the mask of fatherly concern was a strategist who had predicted this reaction from Sonny all along. Sidwell had orchestrated much of the recent chaos in Port Charles, including the fire that nearly claimed Christina's life at Charlie's pub and the explosive that reduced Sonny's penthouse to rubble, severely injuring Michael in the process. And yet, Sonny had been so consumed with his vendetta that he overlooked the trap being laid at his feet. Sidwell, ever the tactician, had begun consolidating his control by forging quiet alliances with key figures like Tracy Quartermain and Drew Kane. Individuals whose motivations could be steered, manipulated, or chemically altered if necessary. With the help of Professor Hank Dalton's clandestine research into neurological manipulation and behavioral reprogramming, Sidwell took the art of control to a new level. There were whispers, even among those close to Drew, that he no longer behaved like himself, that something in him had changed, subtly but alarmingly. If true, it was yet another piece in Sidwell's intricate game, wherein even the most loyal of Sonny's allies could be turned against him without ever realizing it. As Sonny sank deeper into paranoia and obsession, convinced that Marco was the key to toppling Sidwell, the enemy only grew stronger, more entrenched. Every rash decision Sonny made pushed him further from the clarity he needed to see the battlefield for what it was. A carefully constructed illusion, designed to provoke missteps and blind him to the real danger. Sidwell didn't need to lift a finger, Sonny was doing the damage to himself. Jason's internal conflict grew louder with each passing day. Though he had followed Sonny into countless wars, this felt different. This wasn't about territory or honor. This was personal, and messy. Marco, for all his pleading, had never once expressed hatred or fear towards Sonny or Jason. Instead, his words reflected confusion and betrayal, not because of who had kidnapped him, but because of who had allowed it. He spoke of his father's distance, of growing up in a world of cold transactions and whispered secrets. He spoke of his desire to build something different, something clean. Jason listened, unmoving, but the story seeped in. Carly, sensing the dangerous spiral Sonny was entering, did not stay silent. She had seen this path before. When vengeance and fear consumed the man she once loved, and their son Morgan paid the ultimate price. To her, Marco wasn't just another enemy, he was a human being caught in a war of egos, grudges, and generational trauma. She reminded Sonny, not with screams but with devastating calm, that every step he took now mirrored the ones that led to their son's death. And while Sonny insisted he had it under control, that no one would be harmed, Carly knew better. There is no such thing as a harmless kidnapping. There is no such thing as controlled vengeance. Marco's blood would not cleanse the sins of others. It would only deepen the stain Sonny had spent years trying to wash away. Now, the situation teetered on the brink. Jason stood at a crossroads between obedience and morality. Carly fought to be heard above the noise of Sonny's unraveling certainty. Marco waited in darkness, holding on to hope that someone, anyone, would see past his last name and recognize the truth of who he really was. And all the while, Sidwell watched. Waiting. Calculating. Smiling. Because he knew that once Sonny broke his own code, once he traded justice for revenge, there would be no going back. And that, above all, was his true victory. Meanwhile, Jen Sidwell was far from idle. Beneath his polished exterior and the diplomatic calm he often wore in public, he was orchestrating one of the most insidious campaigns ever launched against the power structure of Port Charles. With calculated precision, he extended his web of influence into the highest echelons of the legal and political system. Leveraging strategic alliances with District Attorney Turner, the politically ambitious Ezra Boyle, the formidable Selena Wu, and the increasingly conflicted Jordan Ashford, Sidwell began surgically exploiting every crack within Sonny Corinthos's empire. His actions were not loud or dramatic, but rather deliberate, systemic, and frighteningly effective. Like a virus, he infiltrated the veins of Port Charles's institutions, corrupting from within. Sidwell funded ethically questionable biomedical research, projects that operated just beyond the reach of regulation and oversight. These studies, led by Professor Hank Dalton, had troubling implications, ranging from behavior modification and mind control to neurological reprogramming. Though presented as advancements in psychological treatment or criminal reform, the experiments were quietly repurposed for more sinister agendas: coercion, manipulation, and weaponization. With unlimited funds and political backing, Sidwell ensured the research progressed unchecked, its true intentions masked by scientific jargon and forged grant applications. Simultaneously, Sidwell launched an underground media operation, an elaborate misinformation campaign designed to sway public opinion against Sonny. Disguised as grassroots journalism and independent reporting, the articles and broadcasts subtly painted Sonny as a relic of criminal chaos, while elevating Sidwell as a sophisticated, benevolent reformer. Soon, police reports were being updated, forensic lab results quietly altered, and the timelines in critical investigations no longer lined up. Even high-profile witnesses, once confident and vocal, began to disappear or retract their statements. Some were coerced, others silenced. Anna Devane, seasoned and intuitive, began to sense that something was terribly wrong. As she combed through investigation files, she noted with unease that many elements were just a little too neat, too conveniently resolved, too impeccably clean. The pieces of the puzzle fit together in ways that defied natural probability. One name kept appearing in peripheral roles: Vaughn, a man whose background was spotless to the point of suspicion. No criminal record, no controversial ties, no inconsistencies, an anomaly in a town where everyone had secrets. Vaughn's too-perfect file set off alarm bells in Anna's mind. The more she traced his movements, the more she became convinced that he wasn't just a new face in town, he was a planted operative, embedded long before anyone knew his name. And whoever had placed him there had done so with a chilling level of foresight and control. As Anna dug deeper, she began to uncover a network of interconnected anomalies. Financial transactions masked by shell companies traced back to Sidwell's holding groups. Communications routed through encrypted servers tied to political consultancy firms. An entire web of influence stretched beneath Port Charles, anchored by a man who rarely raised his voice, but whose presence was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a personal vendetta or a territorial battle. It was a silent coup. An intelligent, well-funded dismantling of Sonny's grip on the city, orchestrated by someone who played the long game and played it ruthlessly well. Meanwhile, Marco Rios, abandoned, imprisoned, and bewildered, wrestled with a different kind of awakening. Isolated in his cell and left to his own thoughts, he began to reflect on conversations with his father that, at the time, had felt cryptic or inconsequential. But now, in the silence of captivity, their meanings crystallized. He recalled phrases Sidwell used often: purges must happen, not all pawns make it across the board, clean slates require sacrifice. These had once seemed like abstract musings, disconnected from Marco's life. But now, with every word echoing like prophecy, Marco realized the horrifying truth: his father never saw him as a son to protect, only as a variable to control, or worse, discard. As dread crept in, Marco began to piece together the implications. He had become expendable. His disappearance had not incited panic from Sidwell, nor even mild resistance. In fact, there had been nothing at all. That silence was the loudest betrayal of all. Marco's blood chilled as he finally saw his role for what it was: not a son, not an ally, but a disposable piece in a larger play. And for the first time, the idea of rescue didn't rest on his father's intervention, but on the man who had captured him, Jason Morgan. Though Jason was once the terrifying enforcer, Marco now recognized him as the only person left who might still have a shred of integrity. Jason's silence was no longer the silence of indifference, but of conflict. Marco had seen it in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty, the subtle pause before leaving the room, the way he lingered just a moment too long, as if something inside him had shifted. And Marco clung to that shift like a lifeline. Because if Jason could be reached, if Jason could be convinced that this was all a lie, then perhaps there was hope. Hope not just for Marco, but for Port Charles itself. For as long as Sidwell remained in the shadows, pulling strings with impunity, the city would inch closer to collapse. And unless someone like Jason broke free from the patterns of obedience that had defined his life, Sidwell's vision for Port Charles, a city ruled by secrecy, fear, and manipulation, might very well become reality. When Jason Morgan stepped into the room again, something deep inside him had changed, something that even he, for most of his life, had learned to ignore, suppress, or silence in the name of loyalty. The air in the room was the same as before, stale, heavy with tension, the silence pressing down like a weight. Marco Rios sat hunched but alert, his wrists raw from the restraints, his breathing slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Jason not with fear, but with a wary curiosity. There was no longer animosity between them, just a shared understanding that neither of them belonged in this situation, at least not like this. Jason's eyes lingered on Marco longer than usual. The once detached enforcer now stood motionless, not as a captor, but as a man staring down the consequences of 1,000 unchallenged decisions. In Marco's battered expression, Jason didn't just see a hostage, he saw himself. Not the weapon Sonny had wielded for decades, not the soldier who had followed orders without question, but the man who had once loved, lost, and struggled to remember who he truly was after years of moral compromise. Jason had spent so long following the code of silence, of obedience, of necessity. But now, as the storm of Port Charles darkened around them, he was beginning to see that the world he had helped protect was eroding from the inside out. And much of that decay, he now realized, was born from choices like this, binding innocent men to chairs in dark rooms because someone said it had to be done. Because vengeance masqueraded as strategy. Because the line between justice and retribution had grown too thin to see. Marco sat up straighter, sensing something had shifted. The man before him no longer radiated threat, but uncertainty, anguish, even. Jason wasn't just doubting the mission. He was beginning to question the very foundation it stood on. And for the first time since his abduction, Marco felt a flicker of hope. Not from escape, but from understanding. Jason remembered Sonny's words, words delivered with fire and fury, we need leverage. We need to make Sidwell bleed where it hurts. But now Jason saw the flaw in that thinking. Marco wasn't leverage. He wasn't a threat. He was collateral damage in a war built on shadows and pride. Keeping him here didn't bring them closer to truth, it dragged them deeper into the same cycle of betrayal that had cost them so much already, Morgan, Courtney, and so many others who had fallen because vengeance always devoured more than it protected. Letting Marco go wouldn't just be an act of defiance against Sonny's orders. It would be Jason's first real assertion of free will in years. But that freedom came with a terrible weight. To choose justice over obedience meant risking everything. His position, his relationships, perhaps even his life. But the greater risk, he now understood, was doing nothing, letting fear dictate his morality, letting silence become complicity. Outside, Port Charles was unraveling faster than anyone could contain. Jens Sidwell's web was tightening. He had allies embedded in every institution, judges, law enforcement, the media. He had turned Drew into a puppet through neural manipulation, bought Turner's silence in the DA's office, and now wielded Jordan Ashford like a scalpel, cutting through Sonny's influence with surgical precision. Sidwell didn't just want to destroy Sonny, he wanted to erase him from the city's future altogether. And yet, no one saw it happening. No one, except perhaps Anna Devane, who was beginning to see the connections too clean to be coincidence. She had started tracing Vaughn's movements, uncovering financial ties between him and Sidwell's offshore shell companies. She was following the digital fingerprints left by Sidwell's proxies. But she couldn't move quickly enough, not alone. If Marco remained a ghost, just another missing person file, she might never get the key to unlocking the full scope of the operation. But Marco had the key. He had overheard conversations between Sidwell and Dalton. Words that hinted at Phase 2, at fail-safes, and civil reset plans. He had read messages on screens, meant to be deleted, detailing psychological operations, political blackmail, and social manipulation. He had lived under Sidwell's shadow long enough to understand how the man operated, where he hid his secrets, who he trusted, and who he was preparing to sacrifice next. But none of it mattered if Marco disappeared into oblivion. Jason turned away for a moment, his hand gripping the doorframe, knuckles white. The war inside him was no longer quiet. It screamed in his ears. He remembered Morgan's face the last time he saw him, the hollow grief in Carly's voice when she whispered that he was gone. He remembered Michael lying in the hospital bed after the penthouse explosion, another victim of Sonny's blind fury. And now here they were again, holding another young man hostage, hoping to trade pain for victory. It wasn't justice. It wasn't survival. It was rot. He turned back, eyes locking with Marco's. "This isn't who I am," he whispered, not aloud, but in the way his breath hitched, in the way his hand reached for the restraints. Not out of pity, but principle. Not because Marco asked for mercy, but because he deserved truth. And as the restraints loosened, something irreversible happened. Marco didn't run. He didn't lash out. He simply looked up, nodded slowly, and whispered, "Thank you." Not for his freedom, but for being seen. For being believed. Jason knew the fallout would be swift. Sonny would rage. Carly would plead. The network they had built for decades would tremble. But something far more dangerous had begun to happen, the tides of control were shifting. Sidwell's plan, so carefully calibrated, depended on his enemies behaving exactly as expected. But Jason had just broken the script. Marco's release would send shockwaves through every level of this silent war. Anna would finally have a witness. Drew's behavior could be challenged. Sidwell's paper trail would begin to unravel. The media campaign might fracture. But most importantly, Sonny would be forced to look in the mirror and ask the question he had long avoided: what happens when your enemies stop being the threat, and your own actions become the real danger? In this war, the enemy wasn't just Sidwell. It was fear. Pride. Silence. Jason Morgan had just chosen to break all three. And now, for the first time in years, the future of Port Charles stood on the edge of real change, if they were brave enough to follow it. And so, with the subtle turn of a lock and the quiet release of Marco Rios, Jason Morgan crossed a threshold that would forever alter the landscape of Port Charles. His decision to defy Sonny's orders was not made lightly, but it was necessary, a moment of clarity in a world clouded by vengeance, manipulation, and blurred lines of loyalty. In freeing Marco, Jason reclaimed a part of himself long buried beneath years of bloodshed and obedience. More importantly, he exposed the cracks in a system built on fear, forcing others to confront truths they had long avoided. Marco, once considered a liability, was now the most crucial witness in a war that no longer revolved solely around Sonny and Sidwell, but around the soul of a city at war with itself. As news of Marco's release began to ripple through the shadows, the fragile equilibrium of power in Port Charles began to tremble. Jason's act would ignite questions, unravel secrets, and challenge every assumption that had allowed Sidwell to thrive unchecked. It would force Sonny to face his own reflection, and the consequences of letting rage lead where reason should have stood. And though the city stood on the edge of chaos, it now also stood at the edge of possibility. For the first time in a long time, someone had chosen the harder path, the one that didn't promise victory, but demanded integrity. And from that choice, a new war would begin, not for control, but for redemption.